Hi, welcome to Just Liberty. I'm here with Bob Cochran, who was a longtime professor of law at Pepperdine University and was the Brandeis Chair there, ran the Newt Bar Institute, and is presently now at the University of Virginia. And he has authored many books and articles, many of which focus on what does it mean to be a Christian in the legal profession. And also, what does Christianity have to say in intersection with the law? Professor Cochran's been a tremendous leader along these lines, and so it's our privilege to have him as a guest here today. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Dean Tan.
There are people who might wonder, Christian lawyer? Like, is that sort of akin to like Christian gangster or a Christian, like, is there a compatibility even there? I think I've heard that myself. I remember when I was going to law school, there are those who are Christians who are wondering, why are you going to law school? Why don't you go to seminary or something like that? And then people out in the world who are kind of like, you studied biblical and theological studies before. What are you here in law school for? And I've heard it from both sides. What would you say to both those groups that might see either an incompatibility or at least a tension in terms of Christians being in the legal profession?
Well, first I would, I guess, agree with them that there's likely to be a tension there, or there may be tensions. But at the same time, if you look at the scripture, themes of justice run really throughout the scripture, and lawyers are involved in pursuing justice, either pursuing justice directly, representing people who are in the right, people who are slaves, people who've been discriminated against, people around the world need to have justice pursued directly. But most lawyers are part of a system that at least should be pursuing justice. They play an indirect role in, I think, justice emerging on the back end, and I think the pursuit of justice, either directly or indirectly, is a high Christian calling.
I completely agree with you. The scriptures are full of injunctions to pursue justice, both in terms of preventive justice, if you will, in terms of building good relationships and right relationships, but also, if you will, corrective justice. I'm thinking of a couple different Hebrew words here relating to that, and it seems like the legal profession allows both directly and indirectly.
Just a point on preventative justice. It seems to me that most lawyers, most of the time, act as peacemakers. Now that may come as sort of a shock to a lot of people and just seem kind of counterintuitive. But lawyers who are in the office representing clients, negotiating deals, drafting contracts, a good lawyer will recognize a potential conflict and say, well, we need to deal with this in the contract, or we need to deal with this in the articles of incorporation. If conflict emerges, how's it going to be resolved, and how can we set up a system that's going to resolve it peacefully? Even litigators who like to style themselves sometimes as hired guns, I mean, they spend 90% of their time doing things that are attempting to resolve the case short of litigation. And indeed, 95% of cases are settled.
Yes.
So peacemaking and justice, these are high Christian callings, yes. And I encourage Christians to go into law practice.
Yes, indeed. Justice, justice you shall pursue. blessed are the peacemakers. It's all in there. And, a lot of people have this sort of Hollywood view of lawyers, mainly, operating inside a courtroom in a trial, because that's where the drama is, right? And Hollywood wants to emphasize the drama in things. But, given what you said about the vast majority of cases settled before even a trial.
One of the it used to be my favorite movie critics were Siskel and Ebert, and I've forgotten which one of them said it, but one of them said, if you did a movie about what lawyers really do, nobody would watch it.
How well can you draft this real estate contract, right?
Right,
doesn't necessarily draw
and yet
an audience.
The drafting of that real estate contract in itself is an act of justice. I have a former student named John Derby who, when he was a law student, worked for International Justice Mission, and now has his own organization that represents victims of rape in India. But when he was with International Justice Mission for 2 summers, their assignment for him was to go to Honduras and search the land records, trying to prove that poor people owned land that rich people were trying to push them off of. Well, when students take courses that are about searching titles or drafting real estate contracts, I mean, they kind of roll their eyes. The ones that want to fight for justice, they're interested in constitutional law and trial advocacy. Right. But the drafting of those contracts and deeds and the searching of the titles is really justice work. Now, ultimately, in 2 cases, he was able to show that the poor people owned that. Well, that was in part because some Honduran lawyer drafted that contract well, or those titles well, or that legislation well. Really, the work that lawyers do or should be doing across the board is justice related.
Yes, no, indeed. One of the things that I try to envision Liberty University School of Law being for is to launch students in whatever trajectory or calling that God has for them. And the legal profession is so broad. There's so many different things that could be done. I cited a talk of yours that you had given at the Christian Legal Society's Christian Legal Scholars Symposium about the value of the ordinary practice of law. And I was mentioning that in relation to this broader calling. Great if you're called to do, constitutional issues before the U.S. Supreme Court, but also great if you're drafting wills and creating a trust or, doing other things that may be quieter, might not be as, splashy or, not going to capture the front page of any newspaper, but could really be a service and a ministry and can fulfill these sorts of things, contrary to that popular notion of all lawyers are striding into courtrooms all the time and stuff like that. I mean, I think it's a small percentage who are regularly even involved in litigation, much less a trial, right? Much less appeals or anything along those lines. It's sort of like I've used the analogy of surgeons in the medical profession are sort of like litigators in the legal profession. There are a lot more types of doctors and surgeons alone. Right. And so.
Well, and just as you have preventative medicine, where it's maybe much more important that you teach people to stop smoking and to eat well rather than doing lung surgery or something of that sort. But the preventative medicine or the preventative law doesn't get the attention.
Yes. I think there are a lot of times, though, that ounce of prevention is much better than a pound of cure being brought into a situation, right? So there are a lot of people who are, when they think about law school, maybe they've heard their only kind of identification, other than maybe attorneys who have done work for them, might be the ones who are sort of grabbing the headlines and, doing all this important, like, say, constitutional legal work and such. What would you say to a Christian who's thinking about law school and exploring that possibility? Maybe they're not really sure what they want to do in the law, but in terms of all the range of things that are available to explore a calling to, right, and all the ways that people can really be helped through it. You had said earlier today about the legal profession. I think you were saying something about it being a noble profession, or that the profession itself being that. What would you say to such a person?
Yeah, well, I think two things are quite important. One is the relationship that lawyers develop with clients, and I encourage lawyers to think in terms of loving their clients, loving in the Christian sense of agapic love, of wishing the best for this other person. Sometimes clients may be irritating, they may be irritable, sometimes you sort of you might tend to cringe when the knock comes at the door. But as my old law professor Tom Schaefer used to say, you should see the client as this person God has brought into my life. Clients come in, sometimes it'll be a little minor case that maybe we've done 100 times and we might treat it very casually as lawyers. It's probably the most important thing, the most stressful thing that person's ever experienced. And it's a great opportunity to love and to care for individual clients that you're dealing with. And, lest we too quickly put aside the role of litigator, I think lawyers need to be able to stand up for clients. Unfortunately, the legal system is such now that you may very well wind up with a lawyer on the other side who's uncooperative, who's aggressive at every turn, and you need to stand up for your client's rights and aggressively argue that position. Now, it's best if you get lawyers who are reasonable, who can work together, who can deal with their clients, work collaboratively, come up with settlements, settlement proposals that will help to address the conflict that the parties have, address them in a positive way for both. And I think very often that potential is there. But you also need to have a backbone and ready to push.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. Maybe you've seen this, but my understanding is that the model rules have changed to not talk about zealously representing your client, but it tones it down so that you don't get the sort of Rambo sorts of litigators who are using any and all tactics without boundaries to run over opposing counsel and such. And yet the system is made so that assertiveness is sometimes required or necessary in order to properly represent the client.
Yes, and that advocacy is important for the system. I mean, I clerked for a circuit court judge, and I can remember him telling me that the cases he felt best about, the decisions he felt best about, are ones where he heard strong arguments made on either side. And then, maybe he's convinced by one, maybe he recognizes there's a place in the middle, but he was just a lot more confident when that was done. I mean, he would occasionally bring me a brief that had been filed. He says, this is just terrible. The lawyer doesn't even recognize the issue that's involved. And he'd give me the assignment of writing that lawyer's brief for him, or, coming up with the arguments that the lawyer should have made.
Well, that gets to the heart of the advocacy system, where it's supposed to be the best arguments on each side, and then sort of truth and justice emerging from that as a third-party neutral, like a judge or what have you, is trying to see the whole picture and decide, right?
Yeah, yeah, and that's what I had in mind earlier when I used the term lawyers being indirect advocates for justice. You play, you're a judge or you're a plaintiff's lawyer, defense lawyer, and you play that role, and the system's designed such that hopefully justice will emerge in the end. It doesn't always, but I feel good about the system in the United States in most cases.
Yeah. So what about exceptional instances where playing the role would require selling your soul, so to say, where it is a situation where it would be wrong, maybe against your conscience, maybe against God's word, to just play the role?
Well, now you're talking about what I mentioned earlier when I said there are tensions in the role of a lawyer, and I think those emerge sometimes. I think they are rare, and a lawyer needs to anticipate those kinds of problems. I mean, there's some clients that I think a lawyer should turn down if they recognize that given what the client wants to do, that the lawyer couldn't in good conscience pursue that. At the same time, you may know of the evangelist Tom Skinner from several years ago. Tom Skinner was addressing this issue with one of my friends, Rich Dean, who's a lawyer. At the time, he was a law student, and Rich said, "Oh well, I would never represent somebody like Ford Motor Company, who at that time had just released the Pinto, and the Pinto was exploding." Rich says, "Well, I would
gas tanks."
It's a famous case.
It is.
And Rich said, "Well, I would never represent a Ford Motor Company." And Tom said, "Well, tell me this: would things be any different if you'd been in the room?"
Which room?
The board of directors.
Oh, that room.
If you'd been representing Ford Motor Company at the time the decision was made, whether we go forward with this design or do we pull back the Pinto design.
Oh, so could you have had an impact?
Redesign it. Could you have had an impact?
Oh, I see.
On Ford. Well, Rich reflected on that for a good while and wound up representing some of the major corporations in the country, and I think's had a terrific impact on some of them. But it's a challenge. I mean, I think there's some situations where you might need to exercise conscientious objection. I mean, there's some cases that you might study in legal ethics if you go to law school, where a lawyer, I mean, there's one famous case where a lawyer learns that the opposing party has an aneurysm that he doesn't know about, that was disclosed in some medical examinations that the defense, that the insurance company had done. And this later came out, though the lawyer kept quiet about that. I mean, I think, and the lawyer was protected by the rules of the profession at the time. This was confidential information. Well, I think generally you protect confidentiality. The model rules create some exceptions to that, but I think there may be cases like this where even where the rules don't create an exception, where I think in obedience to God, you follow His exception.
Right. Where something can be ethically wrong, even though legally permissible, and in that instance being ethical and not merely legal, right?
Right. And so you just, in that situation, I mean, I think you should hesitate to do something of that sort, you should seek counsel of maybe wise Christian lawyer brothers and sisters. I think the rules, generally speaking, are rules of reason, are wise rules, but occasionally I think there should be exceptions where we obey God rather than humans.
Right, right. You've thought a lot about this, but what should the character of a Christian attorney look like? And if you could kind of be particular to those who are in the legal profession, right? Not just, what Christians should be like in general, but what's particularly important for Christians in the legal profession in terms of what sort of characteristics that are particularly important, would you say?
Yeah. Well, I think different types of law practice call on different virtues. If you're going to be a lawyer who drafts wills and trusts, compassion, people are talking about death. Compassion would be particularly important. I think for all lawyers, wisdom is important. Practical wisdom really is the key lawyer virtue. Being able to identify a client's objective and, well, first off, having them formulate an objective that would be consistent with their values, and then figuring out ways to pursue them. There was an old movie series several years ago. It was the Divergent movie series, and within this fantasy world, people were placed in particular groups based on their qualities. The people, though, that had the most influence, the people that were able to accomplish the most, were what were called divergent. And I think it's important that lawyers be divergent, that you be both a peacemaker and an advocate. That in the right situation, you're able to jump in and be a very strong advocate. Jesus, within the Beatitudes, we're called to be both peacemakers and to be pursuers of justice or righteousness.
Dikaiosune in the Greek, I think.
That's right. I mean, some translations, I think incorrectly, interpret that as righteousness. That's kind of the traditional one. Well, as Nick Walterstorff suggests, I think it's better translated justice. People don't get in trouble for pursuing righteousness. They get in trouble for pursuing justice. Anyway, I think we don't need to get into take that deeper, but you need to be able to pursue peacemaking and also pursue justice.
Yeah, there's no dichotomy between personal righteousness and public justice or anything like that in what is encompassed there, right?
Correct. Yeah. The Greek word encompasses both of them.
That's right.
Unfortunately, we don't have a good word.
Yeah.
In English that captures what Jesus was saying, but we should pursue both personal righteousness and justice.
What have you thought about the movement of Christians in the legal profession, which you've really been at the forefront of in a lot of ways, in terms of where it's been, where it's at, where it could be? What are your thoughts along those lines? It's really a fairly small percentage of the profession as a whole, right? There's not a lot of salt and light, so to say, in the legal profession. What would be your assessment?
Well, I think Christian lawyers face a challenge. You've got an interesting situation. I mean, I think the profession, I think the advocacy system is a good system for lawyers to be involved with, for Christian lawyers to be involved with. I think you try and have influence as best you can within the profession itself and within large law firms. I mean, I admire lawyers who've gone in all the different directions you might go, trying to be salt and light within a large law firm. Go for it. Some lawyers want to be in a smaller firm with like-minded Christian brothers and sisters, so they can maybe not have the challenges they might have other ways, or take on different challenges might be the better way to put it. But I think there's great potential for being salt and light. I mean, you look at the influence that the early Christians ultimately had in the Roman Empire. When they started off, as Paul often noted, they weren't people of power and influence. Well, they wound up having enormous influence.
What do you think are particular challenges for Christians in the legal profession?
Well, there are a host of them. I think that law can. It's often said that law is a jealous mistress. It's hard to keep your priorities in order. A lot of people who go into law, I think, are seeking to be affirmed, to rise. I mean, I don't think Christians are immune from these sorts of pressures. The desires to be successful within firms, in particularly the big firms, increasingly are requiring billable hours that are far beyond what a person can provide, and still spend proper time with their families. I mean, those are enormous challenges. And of course, sole practitioners and small firms face similar kinds of pressures. I mean, I think balance in life is a big, difficult issue. So I would identify that as a major one.
I remember when I was talking with Mark Hippler, who donated the money for the basketball arena here at Liberty University, one of your former students.
Right.
And he had told me a story about how when he was a student, he was sort of overboard, like not eating properly, not sleeping properly, going nuts, trying to, stay on top of all the law studies and stuff, and that you had sort of counseled him along the vein of what you were saying to have maybe a healthier, saner lifestyle. And that actually enabled him to do better than he was doing when he was kind of going overboard. So I guess it starts in law school.
Well, it does, yeah. And Mark, one of my favorite former students, and now very successful in law practice, but learned a lot of good lessons in law school that carried forward. What
would you consider to be your 3 greatest successes as you've been at this for decades?
Wow. Well, that's an interesting question. I haven't been presented with that. I mean, I think back to Mark Hippler, and of course you I'm sure have similar examples, but I think of students that I taught and might have had an impact on when they were in law school, and now seeing them out and doing wonderful things. So I sometimes I'm not sure you know this, that my students call me Coach. It's
Actually, I didn't know that.
it's my nickname, my sort of personal name from, that I have learned to suggest for my students.
Yeah.
And I see a teacher as being like a coach. I mean, what's important is not so much what a coach does. What's important is what his team or her team does when they're out on the field. Now, a lot of that's rooted in what the coach does before, and I think both loving and challenging, or I guess loving, which involves challenging and encouraging, is important for a coach, and I think for a teacher. But so I'd say the impact that a lot of my students are having would be number one. I feel like you mentioned the Christian Perspectives on Legal Thought book. Very gratified to see the impact it's had over the last 20 years. It was a terrific project to work on, and I think has drawn in a lot of very bright people that are trying to think, well, what are the teachings of Christianity that should have an influence on law? We shouldn't just adopt the Christian faith and make that law, and yet Christians have, I think, an understanding of the way the world was made, and those give us insight as to what law should be. And then I guess the project that I'm working on now.
The book that's coming out next year?
Book coming out. Yeah, that's right. InterVarsity Press would be pleased if I put in a little plug for it. But sometime within the next year, a book that I'm working on recently turned in to them on being a Christian and a lawyer will be out. And so maybe that's in part looking to the future, but I'd be pleased if that does well and has an influence on what practicing lawyers are doing.
Right. Yeah. The provost here at Liberty actually said to me not long ago that coaching is harder than teaching. And I've kind of chewed on that, and I think I know what he means by that. But how is coaching basically like mentoring? What is coaching to you? Why are you called coach? And what does that mean to you? And how have you done that?
Well, I think a coach is a good teacher. So being, I can imagine what he's talking about, but a coach is a good teacher. I mean, you convey skills, and you have players repeat them sufficiently to where they just act on instinct when they get in the midst of a game. But of course, as a real coach, you're also making decisions as the game goes on, and maybe that at least as a law professor, once they graduate, they're sort of on their own.
Well, actually, a lot of the alumni are still connecting with our faculty at
right.
the School of Law, which it sounds like has been true for you too,
Yeah.
where a number of your alumni have stayed in touch with you in
That's
one way,
right.
shape, or form.
No, that's right.
Yeah, but it's not like you have them in the classroom week after week, or it's a different dynamic. But
right.
Yeah.
And they're not going to call me in the midst of cross-examination.
Just a second here, let me call. Yeah, that would be odd if they attempted that. But
I do occasionally have a student call with a pretty urgent legal ethics question.
Okay.
But usually they've got a day to think about it rather than on just a break trial.
Right. Well, thank you so much for your willingness to come and talk with me on this program, and I hope the book that comes out is a smashing success and does very well and has the sort of impact that we've been talking about today. But
Well,
great
great.
to talk with you.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
Uh-huh.